As late as July and August 1939, we were at Oberbarenburg in the Erzgebirge as usual. Nothing was different on this visit from the previous ones. We went on many rambles with Mother, including into the Sudetenland, which had been annexed in October 1938, for example to the convent church at Mariaschein and into the Bohemian mountains. I myself had got to Oberbarenburg by motorcycle and used it to make quite a few excursions, visiting Saxon Switzerland and Dresden. I read the newspapers very attentively and listened every day to the news bulletins. Just as in 1938, the increasingly tense foreign policy situation could be sensed everywhere. The atmosphere became ever more oppressive in the second half of August. Air raid sirens were tested and practice blackouts carried out, private vehicles requisitioned and reservists called up. All this pointed towards the impending conflict. We had entered the last 10 days of peace. The radio broadcast endless military music and unflinching new reports regarding atrocities by the Poles against Volksdeutsche, with news bulletins with ever more dangerous threats sandwiched in between. Many of the reported attacks had been staged by the Nazis, such as the incident at the Gleiwitz radio station on the 31st of August. But others actually did happen. Whom should one believe? A typical comment by adults was, "Without a miracle, war with Poland cannot be avoided," or, "Once the harvest is in, it will start." On the 23rd of August, we breathed a sigh of relief. Shortly before, the unexpected had come to pass. Behind the backs of the Western Allies, the arch-enemies Hitler and Stalin had concluded a non-aggression pact. There was a secret protocol, hardly any knowledge of which had been made public, in which the Baltic states had been conceded to the Soviet sphere of influence. Would this enable the calamity to be avoided at the last moment? Everybody prayed for it. On the afternoon of the 31st of August, there was only one subject of discussion. The Reichstag had been summoned for the following day to hear a declaration by the Reich government. It was fairly clear what this meant. On Friday, the 1st of September, everybody sat by their radio sets, my family too. Finally came Hitler's voice with the sentence announcing the disaster. "Since 5:45 we have been shooting back." Now it was official. We were at war. Depression reigned. What would we soon be having to face? The grown-ups remembered the awful war years of 1917 and 1918. The turnip and swede winter, the shortage of coal, military hospitals filled to overflowing, and so many families in mourning. Soon the radio announced the first measures: food ration cards, clothing coupons classified by age and gender, petrol rationing, travel restrictions, coal quotas, frantic activity. Everything had already been prepared. In the years that followed, we would have to have a blackout, have to hoard, have to evacuate. The only sources of information were the official Reich radio service, which broadcast reports prepared by the propaganda ministry, and the newspapers controlled by the same body. Listening to foreign radio stations was not yet illegal, but for the most part their broadcasts in times of crisis did not provide the true circumstances affecting Germany. In any case, their customary exaggerations condemned them as a non-credible source. East Prussia had been separated geographically from the Reich since 1919, and the Reich's claim for an extraterritorial railway line and road across the Polish corridor to connect with it seemed to me reasonable. Also that Danzig, which had been placed under a League of Nations mandate by the Treaty of Versailles, should be returned to the Reich. I found the claims of Polish atrocities against the citizens of German stock in the Polish corridor and the province of Posen believable, while being dubious about the alleged Polish attack on the Gleiwitz radio station. To a certain extent, there was little sympathy for the Poles, but a future war against the Western powers was considered a great danger, and there was no possibility of avoiding it. Even amongst my own generation, there was little euphoria and enthusiasm for a war. But if the fatherland was in danger, then one had to make a stand and become involved. Whatever events had unleashed the war were irrelevant. Many believed secretly that it would be a short war ending with a quick victory. The very first special bulletins from Poland reinforced the hope that once again the Führer was right. Then, 2 days later, came the damper. It was Sunday, and Aunt Ina had heard on the radio that France and Britain had declared war on Germany. A local war against Poland was developing into a kind of world war, for Great Britain brought into the war the British Empire, Australia and New Zealand, India, and a few days later the South African Union and Canada. This did not look good. I prepared for my return journey to Rastatt. Private journeys by car or motorcycle were forbidden, and so I had to go to the office of the district administrator at Dippoldiswalde for an exemption certificate. I also received a docket allowing me 5 litres of petrol, enough to get me home to Rastatt. After breakfast on the 9th of September, I set out, and spent that night in the Panzer barracks at Bamberg, which I would enter 14 months later as a soldier. The next day I arrived at Rastatt. I became a dispatch rider for the military district, and had a red corner stamped onto my number plate, which showed my authority to use my motorcycle. Rastatt was in the so-called red zone, which was being evacuated. Women and children had already gone, and all schools and most businesses had shut down. The nearby Rhine front was very quiet, the French idle in their Maginot Line, the Germans behind their west wall. Only the big bridge at Wintersdorf had been demolished. Neither side wanted to fire on the other, and a friendly traffic existed across both sides of the Rhine. At least that was how it was on the Upper Rhine, the end nearest Switzerland. In those days they called it Thedrol de Guerre, the phony war. I made myself useful at home. The nightly blackout was strictly enforced. Slackness attracted a fine. Not just once did the neighbourhood warden hammer on the door and shout blackout. Not the slightest chink of light must be seen from outside. In peacetime, air raid and blackout practices had often been held, but these were not taken too seriously. One only bothered with the rooms being occupied at the time. But now it was part of everyday wartime life. Here was something I could do to keep myself busy. Wooden frames had to be made and covered with black paper to put over the windows in the evening. Makeshift solutions were no longer acceptable. Everything had to be done for the long term. In time, the system was perfected. Black curtains for the bedrooms, while rooms with sliding shutters or blinds had only the air slits pasted over. These were checked from time to time. There was no longer any street lighting. The neighbourhoods were black as pitch. In train compartments, only a dim blue light was permitted, while all road vehicles had to place a cap with a small slit over their headlights so that one could be seen by oncoming traffic. Even pocket lamps had to have a cover projecting the light down onto one's feet. Pedestrians wore phosphorescent badges on their lapels to avoid colliding. An air raid shelter was set up in our cellar, which in May 1940 offered us protection from French artillery fire. From October 1939, I attended high school at Baden-Baden. There were just a few of us who met up each morning on Rastatt railway station. Mostly we did go to school, but occasionally preferred to climb the Battert, a 570 metres hill on the edge of the Black Forest, or spent the morning in the reading room at the Spa House. We were known to the people of Baden-Baden as the Westwall Gypsies, and it was rare that any of us was absent. Our schools were reopened on the 7th of January 1940, but closed again shortly afterwards. It was a bitterly cold winter, and no coke was available for heating purposes. At the beginning of February 1940, I submitted my application as a volunteer for the Army Officers Course, since that had always been my ambition. My papers were sent to the Panzer troops. At the end of that month I was accepted as a volunteer and shortly afterwards passed the medical ASFIT for war duty. At the beginning of July I attended for psychological testing at Stuttgart for 2.5 days. This course was feared and the failure rate high, but I returned home with a feeling of confidence. Meanwhile, the 8th grade scholars, amongst whom I had been transferred at Easter, had been informed officially that every one of them called up for military service would be awarded the Abitur, secondary school graduation certificate, if conduct and achievements in class justify it. Accordingly, from early summer 1940, most of my class had left, the majority to enlist voluntarily, some into the SS, after doing 3 months compulsory labour service, with the Reichsarbeitsdienst, RAD state labour service. On the other hand, I was informed by the military district command that I could expect to be called up on the 1st of October. It seemed that my hopes were to be fulfilled. As an aspirant for an active officer's career, I was exempt from the RAD. The following series of events from the beginning of 1940 fundamentally influenced our outlook and morale. My mood after the initial military successes was almost euphoric. To have preempted the British in Norway was a masterstroke. The Battle of Narvik was extremely dramatic. General Dietl defended the town for 4 weeks in the mountains between Narvik and the Swedish border with his force of Bavarian and Austrian mountain troops. He became a national hero. The British retreat from Norway at the end of May 1940 was seen as a clear indication of the superiority of the Wehrmacht over them, at least in the air and on land. The unleashing of the campaign in the West, simultaneously with the operation in Norway, was completely unexpected, and thus came as a surprise to the German people. The violation of Belgian and Dutch neutrality was accepted as a necessity. The German successes in the West were at first almost unbelievable. Every day my father and I would advance coloured pins on a map to show the new front line, as reported by frequent special reports and the Wehrmacht bulletins. Our radio was left on all day so as not to miss anything. At the time of our national success, the Wehrmacht bulletins were always very credible and unvarnished. It filled us with great satisfaction that the armistice was signed at the same place, Compiègne, in the same railway carriage and with the same ceremony as for the German capitulation in 1918. The previous shame was atoned for. Now we could be very accommodating and generous in the armistice negotiations. Or in any case, it seemed that this should be so. Over the next few days, German convoys coming from France rolled endlessly from dawn until dusk to their peacetime garrisons at Rastatt. They included the Rastatt Infantry Regiment 111 and Artillery ATB 35. Great enthusiasm and relief. Crowds waving and flowers, everything as it should be to welcome home a conquering army. And there was I still in school. I bought a map of England, for now we were all sure that England was next. As we know now, we were mistaken. Now my hour had come. On the 18th of October 1940, I received my call-up to Panzer-Ersatzabt 35 at Bamberg. My wish to serve with the Panzers as an officer aspirant was to be fulfilled. The letter was waiting for me when I got home from school at midday. My mother opened the door and led me rather ceremoniously to the dining table, which lay prepared. She told me later how much she was impressed by the happiness shining in my face as I read the content of the letter. In accordance to my plan, I was now a soldier. No longer a dream, but reality. After lunch, I cycled into town in order to tell as many of my classmates or acquaintances as possible of my good fortune. But once you're trained, the war will be long over, I thought to myself. Maybe I might be a soldier of the occupation in France. If I had only suspected what was yet to come in the war and how many years yet it would last. My father feared as much. The victories in Poland and France did nothing to lessen his foreboding that none of our enemies would ever conclude a peace treaty with Hitler. At that time it did not worry me what he said. I went to school next day, took my leave of my professors and classmates, and reported my departure to the director. Thus ended my schooling longed for, but still very odd. I had 5 days left before my parents escorted me to the railway station and waved me off to Bamberg garrison. With an excited feeling in my stomach, I reported to the officer of the watch at the Panzer barracks. No 3 Company was expecting us. 41 18-year-old boys for training with Panzer regiments 35 and 36. 8 to a room, we stretched out and sized each other up. What kind of hotshots they were, with the girls, at sport or drinking beer. For me, apart from sport, this was virgin territory. All the same, I accompanied them to the canteen and drank my first beer. It tasted ghastly, but it was what men did. Next day the life began in earnest. We were always on the go from 6 in the morning until curfew at 10. Exercises and more exercises. A horde of instructors were let loose on us. Officer candidates? Well, we'll see about that. I spent more time on the ground than standing up. For a change, there was tuition, some weapons training. Into how many parts can you dismantle a rifle? Cleaning the barrack room, uniform or locker inspections, always followed by the check-up inspection. Yet all this crap even gave us pleasure. We are hard men, they will never force us under. And the first song we learned was Es ist so schön Soldat zu sein, Anne-Marie. It's so wonderful to be a soldier, Anne-Marie. After 14 days at Bamberg, we were transferred. I went with 20 of my co-recruits to our field unit, Panzer Regiment 35 at Auxerre on the Yonne in France, where we were assigned to an officer aspirants course. Our instructor was Oberleutnant Schulz, after the war a military attaché to the Bundestag. When he was around, our instructors suddenly became human. Otherwise, we had nothing to laugh about. 2 Obergefreit, auxiliary instructors, were extremely sadistic. This period was hellish because we were entirely at their mercy. Nobody dared complain because we were expected to be able to stand it. These primitive beings especially had it in for me because I was a von. After curfew one evening, they roused us from bed in our pyjamas and made us crawl across the muddy village street where a herd of sheep had been in the afternoon. I lost my self-control. It was all because one of my colleagues had a drop of coffee in his field flask at room inspection. When the light was put out and we lay on our straw sacks in our filthy pyjamas, I drew the blanket over my head and howled in anger. I had never before imagined that men could be so foul. But my defiance also grew. Don't let it get you down. They must not have their victory. We were introduced individually to the regimental commander, Oberst Eberbach. He was very human, hearty, and interested. I noticed by his questions and the manner of his leave-taking that he was well disposed to me. I was appeased. At the beginning of December 1940, the regiment moved to the Rhineland. Our course was now held in the large hall of the Windhovel Inn at Solingen-Hochscheid. The proprietress, Aunt Ella, was a determined personality who made sure that the instructors did not treat us too badly in our off-duty hours. From the 13th of December 1940, I was laid up in the military hospital at Wuppertal-Elberfeld with an infected foot, over Christmas and New Year too. When I returned to the course on the 26th of January 1941, panzer driving training had begun. That was a good time. We arranged it so that we always drove past the girls' high school with our Panzer I training tank during their long lunch break and did a lap of honour around the courtyard. We laid it on pretty thick, but unfortunately we never had leave, and so there was no opportunity to return the sympathy shown us. Our course ended on the 6th of February 1941. Another transfer was in the offing for the regiment, but before that we officer aspirants were now classified as Fahnenjunker, officer cadets, senior grade, and spread over the 8 companies of Panzer Regiment 35. I went to one company with Ecke Solf, soon to fall in Russia. The company commander was Oberleutnant von Kossel. We were lodged in billets in the village of Patscheid near Opladen. Solf and I were taken into the house of Father Zimmermann, the local Catholic priest. We had a superb suite with bathroom and proper beds. Long afterwards, I kept in touch with him by letter. In mid-February 1941, the regiment was transferred to the Cognac region of southern France. Our one company was in the small village of Marignac and received new recruits. Some of them were lodged in the village school. I was the room senior. A large room, 13 beds with straw sacks, no locker, a water tap in the schoolyard. It was difficult to keep oneself clean. The commander and part of the company staff occupied a small chateau about a kilometre outside the village on a ridge affording a panorama over the countryside. Vineyards all around. We Fahnenjunker had to eat every midday in the company officers' mess. Really, it was very pleasant to be with men who knew how to eat with a knife and fork and conversed in a cultured manner, and to be served by orderlies. For us, this meant a shorter midday break involving washing, changing into uniform, a long run to the chateau, and after dining a long run back to change in order to present oneself promptly for the afternoon session. Woe betide us if we arrived late. Naturally, the gentlemen officer aspirants. Once a week it was gentlemen's evening at the chateau. The food was better, served with fine Bordeaux wines, a fire burnt in the hearth, and we relaxed in soft leather armchairs. Oberleutnant von Kossel was pleasant, communicative, interested and humorous. I was in his good books. The training schedule was now primarily panzer training, with hardly any more discipline training, and we had a lot of fun. Additionally, I was no longer a recruit. I stood guard and also had duties as an auxiliary instructor. In mid-March 1941, we were transferred to the Burgenland in Austria shortly after the Balkan campaign began. This came as a great surprise to all of us. The offensive resulted from the need to protect our Italian allies against the threat of defeat in Greece, their invasion not having been agreed beforehand with Hitler, and to prevent the British gaining a foothold there. Everything was settled so quickly, however, that we were not called for. At that time I was promoted to Fun- and Junkergefreiter, officer cadet senior grade, private soldier. Now I was a proper soldier. We spent a whole Saturday in Vienna, glorious. But it could not be repeated. Once again we were transported away by train, cattle wagons, straw, soot and filth. The train rattled through the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Where was this train going? On the 25th of April 1941, my company arrived at the Wartherlager, a large military training depot near Posen in the former Wartegau, now in Poland. It was a beautiful time of year, a glorious spring. On Saturdays and Sundays, a company lorry drove into Posen. I always went if I was off duty. There I would meet my godfather, Willy Seidlitz, for a good meal. Every Saturday evening I went to the theatre or the opera, then caught the lorry for the 20 km back to the camp. I also called on the Scheinpflugs, my friends from Oberbarenburg. Being from the Baltic states, the father had meanwhile landed up in Posen. I and my two friends played with model trains. As I was leaving, Frau Scheinpflug said to me, "Your poor mother." I believe that both her sons became soldiers. The war went on long enough for them to qualify. In the regiment, rumours were rife as to how things would turn out next. Either the USSR would allow us free passage into Persia or Iraq, from where we would break through to the Suez Canal, the Red Sea and Egypt. The Russians had placed a railway line and a highway at our disposal. Or we were to relieve Rommel. Nobody thought of an attack on the USSR. By the 1st of May 1941, all elements of 4 Panzer Division, of which our Panzer Regiment 35 was part, had assembled in the Wartherlager. A lively series of exercises began. Almost daily we drove short or long distances, great importance being placed on crossing swamps. It often happened that the entire company would bog down in swampy land and have to be pulled free by the heavy tractors of the workshop company. Great emphasis was also placed on anti-gas training. They kept telling us that we could almost count on gas attacks by our next opponents. My panzer was laid up for a longish period in the workshop. I spent half a day helping out there and learned a lot. After about 5 weeks, the company had an inspection and emerged faultless. It had carried out all work asked of it, except for our panzer, which bogged down in a swamp. The regimental commander, Colonel Eberbach, shit on the driver from a great height for this. Besides panzer training, we had many uniform parades, masked balls, etc., arranged by our Spies, Hauptfeldwebel Klepsig. In this manner, the 7 weeks at the troop training depot passed by quickly. Now and again there was some talk of an operation against Russia. In the final week of our training at Wartherlager, Panzer Regiment 35 received 50 new Panzer IIIs, of which 8 came to our one company. The company was now equipped with 17 Panzer IIIs. 11 had a 5 cm gun and 6 a 3.7 cm gun. The 2 Panzer IIs each had a 2 cm gun. I had been in the rank of Gefreiter since March 1941 and became the gunner in a Panzer III with a 5 cm 38 L42 main gun and 2 coaxial 7.92 MMMG 34S. The 22-ton Panzer III Stiefes 141 had 5 crew, commander, driver, radio operator, gunner and loader. We carried loose with us 1 submachine gun, 5 Luger pistols and a quantity of egg grenades and stick grenades. The firepower of a single panzer was therefore impressive, besides which it was well armoured and fairly fast. Oberleutnant von Kossel, our company commander, was 24 years of age, and for me embodied the ideal type of officer. We would all go through fire for him. He came originally from the cavalry and influenced me with his very human manner of company leadership and dealings with the men. His bravery and calmness, even in critical situations, impressed me again and again. In every respect he was the model officer for me. The final days brought us a lot of work. The new weapons had to be zeroed in and calibrated, the gyro compass installed, the Panzer loaded up. It was extraordinary how much gear and equipment had to be put into a tank, and with proper handling it all fitted in. I sent my valuables home. The orders to roll could arrive at any time. At 19 o'clock on the 11th of June 1941, the company moved out of the Worterlager for the nearest railway station and loaded up there during the night until 3 o'clock. This was very difficult in the dark since there had to be a total blackout, but it went off without a hitch. The train began rolling towards dawn, steamed across Poland and pulled into Warsaw at 19 o'clock. The city made a strange impression on all of us because there was no blackout. Lights were on in the tall buildings, in the tramcars, etc., something which we were no longer accustomed to after 2 years at war. At 3 o'clock next morning we reached Siedlce, 70 km from the German-Soviet border. At 4:30 we began unloading the panzers, which took only half an hour because the ramps were extremely suitable for the purpose. At 7 o'clock we set off for the border. On the dusty Polish highway it cost us half a day. For most of us what we saw was totally new, although those who had been in the Polish campaign were already accustomed to it. The houses were all wooden, with only a thatched roof. There were no brick buildings at all, and the wells were quite peculiar. It was a preview of what we were to see later, week after week, in Russia. Even the small towns were built of wood. We especially noticed the many Jews here, identified by the yellow star. Our readiness areas were precisely laid out. The endless great forests turned into one giant troop depot. Division after division lay here, completely camouflaged against air reconnaissance. The regiment lay in the Wohin area. Our one company had its quarters in the middle of the forest. We lay there for 4 days, each crew putting up a tent. The weather was wonderful, and we were occupied all day with technical duties, which in such an environment provoked a lot of fun. These woods were quite magnificent, all deciduous trees. The only bad thing was the many mosquitoes which bred in the nearby Rokitno swamps. After 4 days it began to rain so heavily that we were driven out of our tents, and the personnel moved into a barracks 5 km away, where the company was given comfortable and, above all, dry quarters. We brought up the panzers to a wood closer at hand, camouflaged them perfectly against aerial reconnaissance, and carried out the duties of oil changing, weapons cleaning, and, most important of all, the fitting of the new refuelling system, using a petrol trailer. Each panzer had one of these 2-wheeled trailers carrying 2 200-litre barrels to be towed behind it, inside which was a pump for refuelling on the move. Before combat, the trailer could be released without difficulty from inside the panzer. The whole thing was found to be unsatisfactory, however, and was later discarded. It was a devil of a job to fit the system, but we succeeded. On the 16th of June 1941 we loaded live ammunition, which took us all day. We had to ship aboard each panzer about 4,000 milligrams rounds and fill the ammunition belts with them, also around 70 HE and 60 AP shells and 10 special shells. Pistol rounds, flares and hand grenades were also loaded and primed. The same day we were immunized against cholera. This was done twice before the operation. In the evenings I went from 3 company with 4 men to 4 company, where Oberleutnant Kraus gave us a brief introduction to the Russian language. Apart from writing the Russian alphabet, we also learned some expressions useful on operations. I never understood anything else of it. Towards evening on the 18th of June, the commander assembled us to give notice that the operation would begin within the next few days. Then he notified our company of its first objective. We were to be the spearhead company, and our orders were to move as fast as possible through thick woodlands with swampy marshes to the town of Kobrin, which was 60 kilometers the other side of the border. The strength of the Soviet forces at the border was not known for certain. Our leading panzer was 114, with Unteroffizier Probst as commander. We had mixed feelings now that we knew that in a few days everything which until then had been harmless fun would come to be in bitter earnest. In the evening the sentries were doubled in case the Soviets dropped paratroops. The day of the 20th of June began with regimental roll call. The entire Panzer Regiment 35 was formed into a triangle for Oberst Eberbach to address us. He spoke grippingly and warned us about the Russians. "You are going into a country in which the people live so primitively that you won't believe it. They don't even have proper toilets." Possibly he spoke in this manner to calm our anxieties or to instill in us a feeling of superiority. In conclusion, we remembered our fallen comrades on the battlefields in Poland and France, then returned to our quarters. On the morning of the 21st of June, we loaded all our personal belongings into the Panzer. Space was limited, and it was no easy task. All Panzers had a metal container behind the turret known as the rucksack, into which every crewman could stow a small travel bag, his overcoat and a few personal items. A second travel bag had to be given up beforehand and went with the divisional baggage train. At the rear of the Panzer was a large wooden trunk for blankets, ground sheets and the like. There was also space in it for brochures, that is, plunder. For that reason, it was also known as the brochure trunk. Almost every Panzer had one. We fixed an empty ammunition box on the track cover. These were small wooden boxes with a good clasp and an interior lining of sheet metal for our rations. A wire was wound around the rucksack, and we hung our field flasks from it so that they were always ready to hand. On the day before the invasion, we received our special rations, for which we found space in the engine compartment and fighting compartment. They consisted of 3 tins of rice or vegetables, 5 small sacks of bread, 3 boxes of Coca-Cola, and a miniature stove per man. This was in addition to our iron rations. None of it could be touched unless ordered. Towards midday, everything was ready. At 16 o'clock, the company assembled to hear the commander's brief address in his usual humorous style. Then we were dismissed to our panzers nearby, which had been towed out of the woods and lined up on the highway. Around 17 o'clock, the Abteilung HQ rolled past, and we followed, driving through Wohin, then onwards to Brest-Litovsk. Our destination was woods north of the town, about 3 km from the river Bug, which formed part of the frontier at that point. On the way, we drove past gigantic fuel dumps which the RAD had laid out within the vast forests. The RAD boys stood on either side of the highway, watching us enviously. At nightfall, the drivers had the difficulty of driving in the dark. Now and again, a short technical halt would be made. Meanwhile, I slept on my gunner seat. It was a slow process, learning to sleep just anywhere. The seat was neither soft nor comfortable, and I was so tall that I could not sleep sitting upright, but in the end I did get used to it. When I awoke at midnight, I found that we had reached our readiness area. Individual panzers were shown to their appointed places, fueled up, gun and MG barrels given a clean and drained of oil, all vehicles impeccably camouflaged, the tracks covered over, and now it was serious. We were told to keep a watch for enemy aircraft. All jobs done, everybody stretched out and tried to sleep. If the code word was given, the operation would begin at 3:15. If not, we would have to stand by. The 22nd of June, 1941. I had had a light doze. By 3 o'clock, on account of the tension and excitement, nobody was still asleep. We got up and talked. Then, at precisely 3:15, the first rounds were fired. Our artillery batteries opened a crazy heavy fire from all sides on the Russian positions. Close by us was a 10.5 centimetres battery. After a short while, the morning sky had turned red. Wherever one looked was on fire. The Soviets made no reply. After half an hour, the firing ebbed somewhat, got stronger again, and then almost ceased altogether. We could hear the rat-a-tat-tat of MG fire in the distance. Our infantry crossed the Bug and established a bridgehead. Towards 4 o'clock, the entire fighting force of the company was drawn up to hear the commander reading the Führer's order of the day to the German Army of the East. The hour of the crucial test has now arrived for you too. Upon you lies the responsibility of saving the culture of Europe from Bolshevism. Our wheeled vehicles, classified as trosses, the rearward services, had not come up this far. A panzer company was made up of the panzer crews, the Kampfstaffel or battle component, divided up into the Gefechtstross, the combat train including the field kitchen, and Tross 1 and 2. Tross Y included the repair unit, ammunition and radio. Tross 2 was the wheeled tross with the orderly room, motor pool, provisions, clothing, weapons and equipment, motorcycle dispatch riders, drivers, paramedics, etc. Our morale was excellent. Towards daybreak, we received another delivery of field post, then waited for our orders to move out. Our infantry and pioneers ahead at the Bug River were not ready for us yet. During the early morning, the infantry had established a bridgehead over the Bug without many losses, and the pioneers were now at work erecting a makeshift bridge. They completed it around midday, and at 13 o'clock my one company received orders to move out. As soon as we got into gear on the highway, the battle with the dust began. Without our issue of protective goggles, we would have been blind. The convoys snaked their way from all sides onto our highway. We had priority everywhere, since we were the spearhead company of the Panzer Division. On the way, there were several stops for congestion on the road. Here the first 2 German wounded, an Unteroffizier and a Gefreiter from Schützen Regiment 12 of 4 Panzer Division, spoke to us. Both had minor wounds and told us about the Russians' tactics. The infantry had found it very difficult to make progress on the other side because of the swampy terrain. Towards 15 o'clock, we reached the makeshift bridge over the Bug. The river here was about 150 metres wide. We had to wait for over an hour because the bridge had been damaged by the weight of troops passing over it. At about 16:30, the company finally crossed it, and now we were on Russian soil. A slug of cognac, and on we went. Soon we saw the first prisoners, escorted by infantry. They had good uniforms, the mud on it providing good camouflage. On the Russian side it was very marshy, and we had to take care not to bog down. We got through without a hitch. The company formed up, and we set off in good order at a decent pace, first through woods already cleared by the infantry and littered with Russian equipment. They had pulled back very hastily. After about 5 kilometres, a halt was called to give the Abteilung a chance to form up. The Abteilung commander, Major von Lauchert, came forward to us. No one company was now given another 3 Panzer IV with a 7.5 centimetres gun and 2 MGs, and got ready for the drive to Corbin. On the way, enemy resistance was to be expected. Our spearhead panzer was commanded by Unteroffizier Probster. Then came Lieutenant Koenig and the one group vehicle with the company commander, followed by 3 Panzer IVs, our hard nuts to crack, T2 platoon, the light platoon, and finally 3 platoon. Behind us rolled 2, 3, and 4 companies, then 2 Abteilung. Other elements such as anti-tank guns, pioneers, artillery, etc., had been attached to our regiment, and as a whole within the division formed the assault group Eberbach, named after our regimental commander Oberst Eberbach. He had already been awarded the Knight's Cross in France, and at the end of 1941 was only the second officer of the Panzer Arm to receive the Oak Leaves for the outstanding successes of his assault group. Our task now was to force our way as deeply as possible into enemy territory. At dusk that first night we set off at about 21 o'clock and headed into the unknown. At first we crossed open country. Behind a hedge I saw my first dead Russians. The sight of it never gave me pleasure to the extent that I had imagined it would earlier. We assumed that the enemy would be positioned behind every clump of woodland, and found it incomprehensible that he had not prepared his defence in those areas of territory ideal for it. The spearhead panzer reported all details to the commander by radio. Every panzer had at least a receiver, a large number of them a transmitter also. The convoy followed a woodland trail through the thickest area of forests. Of the enemy there was no sign. Slowly night came. Our morale was sky high. I sat behind my weapon, but the night was black as pitch, and since I could see nothing through the sight I had a sleep, as did my loader, Gefreiter Aschlimann, whose peace was always difficult to disturb. Following the changeover, our new commander, Feldwebel Volz, stood in the turret and maintained contact with the driver, Gefreiter Jentschek, via the intercom system. In the darkness, the commander had to give steering directions to the driver, for on such a dark night and with the tremendous dust being kicked up, the driver could see very little through his viewing slit. Getting out during a short rest, one would sink ankle-deep in the fine sand. We proceeded on narrow forest tracks with few halts, the leading panzer maintaining constant radio contact with the company. Towards midnight we reached the major Brest-Litovsk Rollbahn without having met any enemy. This Rollbahn was the road to our destination. Rollbahns were shown on Russian maps, of which we had reprints, as autobahns. They bore not the slightest resemblance to a German autobahn. They were simply ordinary paved highways, a great rarity in Russia. We had now arrived amongst the great swamps known as the Pripet marshes, and if one left the road left or right, one sank into them. It was eerily silent. Construction machinery stood along the roadside. The Russians had therefore been busy developing the Rollbahn towards the western frontier. After about an hour, at 2:30, we got underway again. The morning of the 23rd of June was already dawning. Now we made fast progress, except for frequent halts whenever we came to one of the endless bridges over the swamps which the Soviets had been upgrading to take the weight of their heavy tanks. We had to go around all these bridges. At the first villages, what we found particularly striking were the portals at the entrance and exit, scanty frames with lattice work still adorned with fur from the 1st of May. At the centre, a tiny picture of Stalin. In the centre of the village would be a pulpit for addressing the populace. We saw the same thing repeated in all villages and towns. The local people were entirely well disposed to us, bringing butter and eggs to the panzers. The whole village would turn out and stand to the left and right of the road, waving to us vigorously, and they hurried up from the most remote hamlets. The sun rose ever higher, and by 9 o'clock we could make out in the distance the silhouette of Kobrin, and within a quarter of an hour we reached its first houses. That night the company had advanced 60 km, a remarkable achievement bearing in mind the early heavy going and interruptions. To our chagrin, 3 Panzer Division had got to Kobrin before us, and was already continuing along the Rollbahn. This division had had 2 permanent bridges readily available for crossing the Bug, and so, unlike ourselves, had not had to wait for pioneers to build a pontoon bridge before they could set off. We were therefore a little depressed that we now had to follow behind 3 Panzer Division. We parked our panzers in a large garden, camouflaged them well, of course, and attended to minor defects. There was no petrol yet, it was said to be coming up soon. Rich pickings were rumoured, and the commander detached a Panzer II to loot a large warehouse. I reported myself out for a light-hearted stroll through the town. I had left my pistol in the camp and noticed suddenly that there were no other German soldiers in the vicinity, but instead some very shady types. When these began to get unpleasant, I retraced my steps to more inhabited areas of the town, where I came across armed soldiers breaking open a street kiosk. I left with a giant sack filled with cigarettes and soap for the company, where it was all shared out fairly. Our panzer got 30 bars of toilet soap. Other colleagues brought in similar plunder. At midday we received permission to open a box of the special rations. Just as we started eating, we got the order to refuel and roll. We drove across the market square past a giant plaster statue of Lenin flanked by 2 Soviet tanks. As we discovered, every town had at least 1 statue each of Lenin and Stalin, sometimes even the 2 of them seated together on a bench. We crossed the suburbs to reach the railway goods yard, which hosted a huge fuel dump. Here we took what we needed: oil canisters for air filters and engines, water canisters, very important because of the heat, and many other useful items. Then we refueled from gigantic barrels. The primitive Russian refueling installation caused us a number of problems. After the whole company had fueled up, we found a spot nearby for sharing out the plunder. Shirts, briefs, underwear, blankets, sleeping bags, cooking utensils, party badges, trousers, boots, etc. The company had also come across a case of butter and some big Dutch cheeses. We had no bread and so ate cheese spread with butter, which tasted marvellous. We were quite happy to make do in the circumstances. Towards evening we drove across town again to the Rollbahn. Ahead, 3 Panzer Division was in action. Russian tanks had attempted to attack the town, but came to grief with much bloodshed, and we soon saw the pitiful remains. No one company had orders to secure the area 10 kilometres beyond Kobrin. As it grew dark, we were at readiness in a small wood and camouflaging up, but after half an hour, just as we finished, another order came for us to do the same thing in another position. Meanwhile, night had fallen, black as pitch, and we noticed fires all around us. As we got closer, we saw that these fires were from burning wrecked tanks, which had been finished off by 3 Panzer Division. Towards midnight, the company put up at a farm. 2 platoon was responsible for security, the rest of us could get some sleep. I took some straw from the barn and slept behind my Panzer, nicely warm near the engine, stretched out in my stolen sleeping bag. Reveille was at 4 o'clock. 10 minutes later the company moved out. Each morning was the same. Everything had to be done pretty damned smartly. Washing and coffee were luxuries and had to be forgotten. What with the dust, which mixed with the oil and sweat, we looked like pigs. Our uniform was no longer black but a filthy grey. It was not far to the roll barn, where an indescribable sight met our eyes. One burnt-out Russian tank after another, some with great shell holes, some destroyed by our aircraft in low-level attacks. On that morning alone we saw the tanks of at least a full armoured division. In addition, there were guns of every calibre, field kitchens and other military equipment. It was really difficult to take it all in. The great marshes lay either side of the roll barn. One needed to be careful not to stray off the highway. We kept going flat out until about 10 o'clock, and then stopped for the rest of the day. These long runs were wonderful for everyone but the drivers. We had rustled up a piece of leather upholstery for the rear of the Panzer, and sat on it as if it were a sofa, in the crazy heat constantly holding our field flasks, and gazed through our goggles at the wreckage of the Russians. If one felt hungry, a slice of bread thickly spread with butter did the trick. Those were the finest hours for the common soldier. From 10 o'clock we got the vehicles in order, cleaned the air filters, very important in this heat for, with a breath of wind, dust would get into the carburettors and the engine would not run properly. After that, our time was our own. First, we had a good look at the Russian equipment. Naturally, their tanks interested us most of all. We ate, slept or wrote as the mood took us. A Fieseler Storch flew above the roll barn, keeping constant watch. Prisoners arrived in small groups, sent back from up ahead. They seemed to be Mongolian for the most part. Some wore civilian clothing, contrary to the rules of war, but were instantly recognizable as soldiers. When darkness fell, we set off again and drove through the night. I slept wonderfully on the hull at the rear of the Panzer. At first light I was awake again, the same scene right and left of the highway. Towards 10 o'clock the order came for the company to secure a bridge against ground attack aircraft. We soon reached the said bridge and took up position. It was not a very favourable spot for us, since there was no cover anywhere. Camouflaging a Panzer in the open was very difficult. An 8.8 centimetres flak battery had come up to protect the bridge against air attack and was very close to us. It was being hinted that the Russians would do anything to either capture the bridge or destroy it. There was a lot of work to be done on our vehicles, for after such a long run everything had to be checked over. We worked on the tracks, air filters and weapons were cleaned, we fueled up, etc., all of which took up a lot of time. I was just about to have a wash for a change when the flak suddenly opened up. We saw 6 bombers at very high altitude quickly turn tail under fire, but they came back a quarter of an hour later, and scarcely had we recognized them than their bombs exploded in the midst of the flak position, though without causing any great damage. The flak was very accurate, and soon a bomber was plummeting earthwards. It roared ever faster towards the ground, where it exploded. On the way, a wing became detached and spun down slowly like a flaming torch. That was the first of the many aircraft that I saw shot down. After another 30 minutes, another wave came. We saw the bombs drop and explode between the widely spaced Panzers. Our chief radio operator, Gefreiter Hildwein, was wounded with a splinter in the knee. Until then, we had watched without taking cover. This was all new to us. The commander now gave the order to dig foxholes beneath the Panzers. We hacked out a large square hole, tossed down blankets, and then the Panzer was driven over it for cover. If another air raid came, we would all crawl under the Panzer and be safe to some extent. One would hardly believe the monkey-like rapidity with which we abandoned the Panzer and got under it on such occasions. That morning there were 6 Russian air attacks, in which they lost 3 aircraft to flak and our fighters. Because of the immense plague of mosquitoes, we made a small fire and played cards. I lost 20 Reichsmarks. But what did money matter any longer? The amounts being bet sometimes went as high as 200 Reichsmarks. Then gambling was forbidden, thank God. For the rest of the day we had quiet, and not even at night were we disturbed. Next morning, the 26th of June, we went to alert status, but nothing happened. Waiting for the first real engagement with the enemy began to get on our nerves. Towards 11 o'clock, the order came to get the vehicles ready. In great haste, everything was loaded aboard and stowed. Barely a half-hour later we moved out, down the Rollbahn again, just as on previous days. Around 15 o'clock, we suddenly received orders to go to battle readiness. The weapons were loaded and freed. We were to attack an airfield to the left of the Rollbahn and secure it for the use of Mulder's squadron. Soon the company bore left off the Rollbahn along a narrow woodland track. Here the dust was appalling, and despite our tight hatches, it still filtered through the cracks into the interior. This made it very demanding for the drivers, who literally drove into a grey fog with no sight of the vehicle in front. Through my gun sight, I could also make out nothing. It was amusing to ask ourselves what would happen now if the enemy attacked. Nevertheless, calm and composed, we headed ever onwards into the unknown for 20 km. On the way we came past our artillery, which had the airfield under fire. All safety catches were now off. At any moment we might encounter the enemy. Suddenly the wood cleared and the great airfield lay before us. Everywhere were Soviet aircraft either burning or already smouldering wrecks. The Mulder's fighter squadron, coming in at low level, had done its work well. There was no sign of the enemy. The company formed a battle line and brought the edges of the woods under fire on the assumption that the Russians might be hiding there. Then it grew dark, and we withdrew from the airfield, cleaned the weapons, ate and slept. The 27th of June 1941. Reveille was at 2:30. Nevertheless, we awoke refreshed. At 2:45, the commander told us of the day's attack. The company was to make a feint across the airfield and then operate against the nearby town of Baranovichi. The other companies and 2 Abteilungen would make a wide sweep to break down any resistance. As soon as we moved off at 3 o'clock, alert status was ordered. We spread out at high speed in all directions to clear the airfield, ran into some marshy undergrowth and had to make a detour. This led us past a large fuel depot which, as we found out later, was heavily mined. Some of our vehicles came very close to running into the minefield. The Russian artillery fire was so accurate that we suspected they must have a spotter nearby. Their shells fell fairly close, and every time one exploded, we would involuntarily duck our heads even inside the panzer. We guessed that the observer was in a water tower, fired on it and tested our weapons at the same time. A success. The enemy artillery ceased fire. We set off again towards the town which was close by. In a meadow we passed 8 brand-new AA guns, probably never used against us, a welcome capture. We were ordered to bombard the town, but then the order was cancelled because 2 company had already entered it. When we reached the town limits, we went straight in. The streets were empty. Our panzer got stuck in a hole, and only the skill of our driver managed to get us free. Meanwhile, the company had gone on ahead. We drove through the town frantically in search of the company, but in vain. The enemy was expected to appear everywhere, a very unpleasant situation. After some time, we re-established contact by radio. The company had driven through the town and kept going until they had halted at a patch of woodland from which they received fire. The company had replied with the MGs and silenced the enemy. The MGs of our panzer were not totally trouble-free, being new and not yet zeroed in. At the first opportunity, we would have to rectify this. By radio came the report that the advancing 18 Panzer Division was already in our vicinity. This meant that the encirclement of Bialystok was complete. The company turned about and returned to the town, where relatively little damage had been inflicted. We stopped in the town centre. Each panzer had to have 1 man to keep guard on it while the rest of crews could go organising. Soon we found a warehouse with hundreds of crates. All were forced open with the bayonet and anything useful taken away. Wine, mineral water, especially important in the heat. Chocolate creams, sweets. Soon every panzer had a few crates and beaming faces everywhere. The crews bartered between themselves, and so each man got what he wanted. I found some bottles of a very good liqueur. Meanwhile, 18 Panzer Division rolled past us in the city without the chance to stop. My, were their faces long. It seemed laughable how they drove through town in full fighting order, protected on all sides, while we had been here quite some time and moved about completely freely. Further searches had revealed a clothing store from where anybody could have shirts, socks, briefs, and ladies' clothing for making scarves. There was no more washing clothes. Anything dirty was thrown away and replaced by something new. To cap it all, my tank commander, Feldwebel Foltz, had discovered 4 giant barrels of beer, and our Panzer kept one. Now we drank the whole time, even when on the road. Soon we had no idea where to stow all our loot. This was not at all in accordance with good order and military discipline, and after 3 hours in the broiling heat we turned about, drove back across the town, where the populace was now daring to venture out on the streets, and an hour later we reached the airfield, sighting our first fighters circling overhead. Molders wanted to land here. Dead Russians lay everywhere, but as strange as it may sound nowadays, we only slowly grew accustomed to the sight. We kept driving for about half an hour until a halt was called in the shelter of some woodland. The mosquitoes plagued us so infernally that we made small fires everywhere, but these were not much use. We worked on our panzers through the midday hours. My MGs were calibrated by the armourer, or at least he had a try. Finally came a delivery of field post, though I got nothing. In the evening we slept together near the panzer. Tomorrow was my birthday. Often I thought of my family. How were they really getting along? In our filthy uniforms we were a seedy-looking crowd, not a clean spot anywhere. Our skin grey with dust, the pores black. If one rubbed a hand over the skin, it left little black rolls, and the fingerprints stood out. Everything was sticky, filthy, and stank. Nothing could be done about it. If only we had some water for washing, or a bath. Such thoughts were best left aside. At 1 o'clock we were awoken suddenly and informed we were moving out. This was not easy in the darkness. I remembered in passing that this was my 19th birthday. We got rolling again, everybody half asleep. After 2 hours a halt, day was breaking. Now we could get back to sleep. In the morning I wore my new Russian underwear for the first time. The dirty ones were simply thrown away. That was what we always did. Finally we could wash a bit. Each man got a quarter bucketful of water. Before washing it was brown, and after... My loader, Walter Ashliman, went off on a hunt for poultry, and came back after some time with a chicken he had shot. We cooked it in our wash bucket. I was just getting the fire going, and the chicken was almost ready, when suddenly I heard a shot, and Ashliman tipped over from the panzer. While cleaning his pistol, he had shot himself through the stomach, a clean through and through, although it looked fatal. A motorcycle rider brought the Abteilung doctor and an ambulance 10 minutes later. After emergency dressings were applied, he was taken off to the main dressing station for an operation which saved his life. Our mood was now very low, my birthday joy forgotten, and nobody wanted to eat the chicken. I was assigned another loader, and around midday we got underway again. The dust made us suffer terribly again. Our throats were dry, our eyes smarted. Even the protective goggles were not totally effective, for dust found its way through every tiny crack. Around 4 o'clock we got back to the roll barn of our previous advance, and now we headed east. Some panzers had gone into the workshop for repair, a number having damage caused by the Russian petrol and oil. Thus the company's numbers were reduced. At the sides of the roll barn, always the same picture of endless material wreckage. Was everything being destroyed? Our tankers overtook us on the way, and we were refueled during a rest stop. Then darkness fell, and with it came another difficult period for the drivers. I stood up in the turret and gave our driver his instructions through the throat microphone while the rest of the crew slept. The journey was very tiring. In the dark one had to keep the sharpest possible lookout, so on it went until 5 o'clock next day. Upon arriving at the town of Sluzsk, we rolled in straight away. On the outskirts, the Russians had built a sports stadium in the Bolshevist Roman style. The figures had a blue face, otherwise everything else was white plaster. The columns were painted blue from top to bottom. Also not forgotten were the statues of Lenin and Stalin, never absent. We stayed for half an hour in the town while a shop was ransacked, but to our disappointment it had already been thoroughly plundered. Then we moved on with a dreadful rattle over the miserable paved streets. In the town centre was a large square surrounded by party buildings. Dead centre stood a very large pulpit painted with a relief of the October Revolution on the front face. Left and right of it stood statues of proletarians, and over everything at the rear towered a larger-than-life statue of Stalin. Loudspeakers were fitted at every corner. The public assemblies were held here. We also saw, as later in other places, banners stretched across the street which probably said, "Workers of the World Unite," or something similar. The town centre was almost undamaged, but other neighbourhoods were totally gutted, probably torched by the Russians themselves. From the giant fields of rubble to our right and left, only chimneys and great iron stoves poked through. We sped along the Rollbahn, we could make 40 kmph on the road, until 6 o'clock and stopped at a small village to work industriously on the panzers. The most important thing as ever being to clean the air filters of dust. This took 2 hours, and then the species brought out a large number of big boxes containing several thousand looted eggs. Anyone could help himself. I boiled 100 for my crew and packed them in an empty ammunition box together with 50 raw eggs. For myself, I used 20 eggs to make an omelette which I ate alone. I had no fat, and so it was quite hard. The consequence was frightful stomachache, and I vomited the whole thing up. At midday we set off once more. I lay on the rear of the panzer hull, miserable and suffering, and had to use the floor hatch several times. It took 3 or 4 hours to reach the airfield where Mulders's squadron was to be found. Then we settled down quietly. This was a major disappointment, for 3 Panzer Division was ahead of us on the Rollbahn, and we wanted to be the leader, wanted to show what we could do. Soon, however, we would have the chance, for at midday the commander's panzer, the 100 Er, that is Panzer number 100, broke down with engine damage and had to go into the repair shop. Oberleutnant von Kossel now took over our panzer, bringing with him his loader, Schütze Hofweber, who was up to the mark. Feldwebel Foltz, previously our commander, now became our driver. Hartmann remained the senior radio operator. Thus I held the position of gunner in the panzer of the company commander, which I considered a distinction. Yes, I was proud to have this prominent place. Towards evening, Russian aircraft approached the airfield. Our fighters went up to intercept them, and eventually shot down 7. The fighters circled continuously above our panzer. We felt a mood of great enthusiasm. In the night, the mosquitoes pestered us dreadfully. On the morning of the 30th of June, the usual camp regimen. Not until the afternoon did we finally get on the Rollbahn, hoping for a decent encounter, but irritatingly often we found the highway totally blocked. Sometimes 3 convoys would all be heading in the same direction alongside each other. Overtaking was impossible. We found out that 2 Abteilungen had been given another mission in which they had to bear away left from the Rollbahn and attempt to overtake 3 Panzer Division on their left flank, all so that we could finally see some action. It was very depressing to be always following 3 Panzer Division. In the evening we stopped in a small village and had to stand guard along a section of Rollbahn. In the twilight we changed the oil over a ditch, then camouflaged the panzer in a garden. At 23:45 the sentries awoke the whole company, and we assembled in order to congratulate our commander on his 24th birthday at midnight. Bottles of champagne and cognac were produced and did the rounds. The commander made a brief speech of thanks while some of the advanced sentries fired a salute. By 1 o'clock we were all asleep again. We had to be rolling by 5 o'clock, and in the morning it was always cool. We were to follow 2 Abteilungen. In the course of the 1st of July we approached the Beresina. The Beresina in White Russia was a very special river for me. I remembered the fate of Napoleon and the expanses of Russia which now lay before us. Would we go down the same path? Was it also do or die for us too? When, how and where would I recross this river westwards? Napoleon had reached Moscow in an incredible triumphal procession before the great catastrophe overtook the Grande Armée. These and similar thoughts preoccupied me very much in those days, and we had not yet received our baptism of fire. At the Beresina, our force had apparently run up against stiff resistance. Battalion Hoffmann was supposed to establish a bridgehead there, but had come up against a Russian armoured train. No 6th Company came to their aid. Now we drove left off the Rollbahn and crossed a bridge which the Russians had wanted to set afire during the night. Some of the tracks had become boggy from heavy downpours. The sky did not look all that promising today either. The panzers had to tow the motorcycle riders and lorries through the worst muddy parts. We kept going all day, passed the town of Svisloch at midday, and reached the Beresina half an hour later. A kilometre from the river we saw a Russian tank platoon, totally wrecked. The 2 bridges over the Beresina were still intact. The Russians kept trying to establish a bridgehead on our side of the river, but had been ripped to shreds by the quadruple flak placed here. The panzers would be crossing the river by the great railway bridge, with planks laid between the rails. Our I-Abteilung made a halt in a small patch of woodland, with a 15 centimetres howitzer battery beside it. The battery began firing towards evening. We set up a huge tent made from our tarpaulins behind our panzer and made ourselves as comfortable as possible. In the night it rained torrentially, and the water entered the tent from all sides because the trench around it had not been dug properly. We sat with our bottoms in water. One after another we awoke and got hastily into the panzer, which was far too narrow to accommodate 5 persons sleeping. We were very cold and our bones ached from sleeping upright. Nothing is worse than being soaked through, dog-tired, frozen, and having to sleep awkwardly. Sleep comes for a short while, then one starts into wakefulness. Towards morning the weather changed. We dried ourselves and our things in the warm sunshine. Then, to mark the commander's birthday retrospectively, we had a picnic in a fine spot nearby. The whole crew lay on blankets around a primitive table. We served ourselves butter, bread, eggs and pork chops, and fabulous French red wine, a personal gift from the commander. Our mechanics had brought a pig on their motorcycle together with frying pans from a nearby town. The meat was cut into equal portions, and soon everybody was frying, for we had more fat than we needed. Small petrol fires flamed everywhere. At the time we had plenty of fuel. We lazed all day waiting for the order to pull out. In the evening the opportunity came to tune in for the news, reports of enormous successes being made by our troops. We were really proud to be part of it. If only I could have news from home. The best time of all was when the field post was distributed. When night fell, we were still seated on our panzer, and Hans Graupel played some tunes on his accordion, which left us all dreaming of home. We hoped that the next few days would bring us our first engagement.